From the nation's capital in Washington, D.C., Call on Congress. The program discussing national issues that affect Oklahoma. Your host, U.S. Representative Tom Cole.
Thank you for joining me today for another episode of Cole on Congress. Today I'm pleased to welcome Congresswoman Kristi Noem to the program. Kristi's serving in her first term in Congress representing the state of South Dakota. Congresswoman Noem is a rancher, a farmer, a small business owner, owning and operating a hunting lodge. Kristi serves on the Ag Committee, on the Natural Resources Committee, and on the Education Workforce Committee. She's a freshman class liaison of the Republican House leadership team, so she actually sits at the leadership table, and frankly has kind of hit the town with a lot of force, a lot of energy, and a lot of notoriety. I mean, your race, frankly, was one of the most hard-fought races in America.
It was. Thank you for having me, first of all, and it's good to talk to Oklahoma. And I think a lot of people in Oklahoma have some of the same principles and values that people in South Dakota do. But yeah, it was a tough race. And
what persuaded you to run in the first place?
You know, I was just a small business owner and was struggling with the same thing that everybody else across this country was struggling with. We had no tax certainty. We didn't know what this administration was wanting to do to us as businessmen and women. The regulations were frankly killing us. It was very hard to keep the doors open. And I just thought, you know, we need somebody who has some common sense that will go to Washington, D.C. and have a level head and say, listen, this is what happens when you pass things in Washington, D.C. What happens to real people back home?
Well, you'd had a little bit of a history in the state legislature in South Dakota, kind of taking on the establishment a little bit, shaking things up, and asking some tough questions evidently needed to be asked there.
I did. I ran for the legislature the first time in 2006, and then my second term, we have 2-year terms, ran for the assistant majority leader position because I really recognized that leadership has an opportunity to get a lot of things done. And if I was going to be there, I wanted to be as effective as I possibly could. So I did. I worked real hard on changing the way we evaluate property taxes in South Dakota. We don't have an income tax in South Dakota. So a lot of our state income and revenue comes from property taxes, but some of it was quite inequitable. So we did. We worked hard on economic development and making sure that our tax reforms were fair.
Well, your class is, you know, maybe the most interesting class to arrive literally in decades in Congress. I mean, the size of it, 87 new Republican freshmen, literally transformed us from a minority into a majority, and actually had a lot of unity in its thinking, and this was a real voice of America kind of election, sending us people that wanted to change direction. What do you think of your fellow freshmen?
Oh, I think they're great, and they're growing. You know, with the 2 special elections, we've got 89 now.
I hadn't thought about that.
That's right. So, you know, they are a unique group, and that's what I tell everybody is that, you know, what's interesting is out of those 89 members, over 40 of them have never held public office before. So they were just people running businesses. They weren't on city councils. They weren't mayors. They weren't in state legislatures. They were businessmen and women or raising families at home that decided to run for Congress and come out here and be a part of the solution. So they're unique. We've got doctors, but we've got farmers. We've got a funeral director. We've got a gospel singing preacher. So they're very diverse, but they're good people.
A lot of veterans, too, particularly from the Iraq and Afghanistan conflicts.
Yeah. They recognize what it means to really step up for your country.
And actually your class did, because you know, I would actually say in your case, any political consultant would have said, don't do this. You know, you're running against a very competent, famous name, you know, politician in South Dakota, entrenched incumbent. You got a great career right here in the state legislature. You know, why don't you spend some time? And the fact that you were willing, frankly, to put a great career aside, run a big risk, says a lot about you.
Well, you know, it was a tough race, and it certainly was something that a lot of people didn't think we could win. But we just decided that we had somebody out here who was voting wrong and wasn't voting for the small business person, and that I felt like it was my job to make sure that South Dakotans had their voice back.
Well, you've done that, and one of the great things about you, obviously, as somebody with a background in agriculture, working in production agriculture, is having you on that committee. I've got 14,000 farms and ranches in my district. Obviously, my colleague from Oklahoma, Frank Lucas, chairs the committee that you serve on. But tell us a little bit about some of the perspectives that you bring from production agriculture, and what are your chief concerns about agriculture policy in the country?
Well, I grew up on a farm and ranch, and from the time I was little, I knew that's what I wanted to do. When I grew up was farm with my dad, and so I did that. My dad passed away in an accident when I was real young, when I was going to college, and so that's when I took over the operation and first started getting involved in some of the policy as well, because when you're running an operation is where you really realize how policy does or doesn't work for an operation. So then I started to really see an interest when I came to Congress and being on the Ag Committee, because I really believe that our producers today need to manage their risk. Agriculture is such a volatile industry. The rain can shut off at any time. You can get a flood that'll come in and wipe out your crop. All sorts of things. A hailstorm will really do a lot of damage to your whole livelihood. And in today's economy, and in this market industry, you could lose your operation in 1 year if you have a true devastating event that comes in.
How'd you talk your spouse into letting you do this?
You know, I have got a great husband. There's not too many husbands that would allow their wife to go off and leave every week and work and come home and be at home only on the weekends. He's a great guy.
Well, clearly so. A lucky guy, too.
Yeah.
But tell us a little bit. I know you've not only, arrived at important committees, you're actually introducing pretty significant pieces of legislation, which is really good to see. And one of the things that you've been working on is, which drives my farmers and ranchers wild, and drives most people in Oklahoma wild, is this idea of the EPA defining dust as a pollutant.
Yeah.
What's the impact, and tell us a little bit about your legislation.
Yeah, we've all kicked up a little bit of dust before. Driving up and down our gravel roads or baling hay, and Oklahomans certainly understand that as well as South Dakotans do. But the EPA was going to go to standards that would have potentially put producers that were simply baling hay in violation of their clean air standards. And up to the fines, then the penalties that they were talking about were up to $37,000 a day, which obviously doesn't make sense in today's economy. So my bill just specifically said that the EPA could not use any funding to put these standards into place, put a moratorium of sorts on it. And it's got a lot of momentum in the House and in the Senate. They've been talking about it as well. And so we have it scheduled for October 24th for that week to come to committee. And I'm expecting it to do very well and come to the House floor later this year.
I actually think it will. I sit on the Interior Appropriation Subcommittee, and where Lisa Jackson, the EPA administrator, comes by, and we grilled her pretty hard on that. And there was actually bipartisan, amazement that. And she said, "Well, we haven't done it. We're only studying it."
No, they always say that.
Yeah.
Of course you study it, but they announced their intentions very clearly, and that's why we got so aggressive on this. Is because we knew how detrimental this could be to rural America. We wanted to make sure that it didn't get put into place.
Well, I literally asked her, not every road in America is paved, and if you've ever been to Southwest Oklahoma in the spring, the idea that we could possibly farm, without raising some dust. As a matter of fact, I recall I said, I think you're about 80 years too late for dust in Oklahoma. We've actually taken care of the big problem so far.
Well, and we defined it as nuisance dust within the bill, which I think is a good definition to have. And then also we add some flexibility for state and local governments as well, which is very necessary within the Clean Air Act. So I'm excited about it. And this, they're backpedaling a lot, the EPA is, but this is the most anti-business, anti-farmer EPA we've seen in our lifetimes. And I think we need to push back on a lot of the regulations they're putting forward.
Oh, I don't think there's any doubt about it. Another area that you've been working on is National Labor Relations Board. Now, a lot of our listeners or viewers will be aware of that through the Boeing conflict, obviously, in South Carolina, and the really outrageous decision there that literally jeopardizes 1,000 jobs, $1 billion investment in America. But you've also, another thing we have in common is Indian tribes, and you've looked at what the impact of the NLRB is on them, and have a pretty interesting piece of legislation on that.
Yeah, well, traditionally, the NLRB didn't declare jurisdiction over tribal governments over the past several years until we got to 2004. And a court decision changed that, and that was impacted. So my bill specifically says that we should treat tribal governments and tribal businesses the same as any other federal, local, or state government, and not give the NLRB jurisdiction over those businesses. So this bill certainly is in keeping with the decades long of how we've interpreted that act and I'm hoping that this bill will pass as well. It's got a lot of bipartisan support, and our tribes definitely want it. Our tribes in South Dakota have signed on in support, and they recognize that they want their businesses to be viable. They don't want to have to worry about unions coming in and taking over and monopolizing their business decisions.
Well, actually, my tribe is actually in a court right now, in a court case with the NLRB,
yes, they are.
and actually won the first round in federal court. Got a great 34-page decision, but it's exactly that. It was union interference, and actually it's a non-unionized facility. We don't have union, but they brought the complaint to the NLRB. The NLRB ruled against us. We went to court, won the court case so far, and it's on appeal. So I can tell you your legislation is very popular with the 11 tribes that I represent.
Well, you know, it threatens their tribal sovereignty, is truly how they view it. And so anything we can do to protect that for them is critically important.
And the other, you know, you're also caught up in the bigger battles here. Obviously, we all got our little legislative initiatives and things that are important and significant. But probably the biggest single thing in front of us right now, in a sense, is the American Jobs Act, what President Obama has placed in front of us with the idea that it's going to actually create jobs and opportunity. What are your views on that legislation?
Well, I'm not a supporter of the plan. I think it puts way too many permanent tax increases into place for short-term spending provisions. You know, a lot of it is a repeat of the last stimulus package. And the infrastructure bank is something that we see in 33 other states that already have it. It's redundant. It's more bureaucracy. It's more red tape. And, you know, this isn't what the American people have asked for. So, again, the president has put together this package and proposal for political reasons that isn't truly going to help our economy.
Absolutely true. And, you know, although, you know, again, occasionally we can find some common ground with the president. And just this week we had an opportunity to do that. I know you supported free trade agreements. That's got to be important to agriculture in South Dakota. It certainly is in Oklahoma. Yeah,
you know, since the U.S. agreement was made with Chile, just ag exports in South Dakota have increased 512%.
Wow.
So when you tell that story and people recognize what it can do for our local ag economy, I mean, these three trade agreements are huge, and we've been wanting them in the state for many years. We're glad that the president finally decided to send them up to us so we could vote on them and get them done.
It was frustrating. I actually was on a trip with our colleague Kay Granger earlier this year, and we were in Colombia, Panama, Guatemala, and Mexico, actually largely on drug interdiction issues, but the free trade issues obviously came up in Panama and Colombia, and the Colombians were almost beside themselves, saying, look, we really want this deal, and unfortunately right now, literally the President of Colombia, President Santos, went to Kansas University and graduated in 1970. He greeted me with an enormous Jayhawk basketball.
I bet he did.
And sort of saying, I know you'll know what this is.
You'll know what this is.
And he said, you know, I went to school right next door in Oklahoma, and I know you guys grow a lot of wheat, just like Kansas does. We traditionally have bought a lot of that. You're losing your market here. We've signed a free trade agreement with Canada, and they have an 11% advantage on you.
We've lost a lot of market share.
We really have.
Yeah, we have, and that's what's critically, and our farmers recognize that, and everyone, even within other industries, recognize that we lose market share every day we don't have those types of agreements in place. So it took a long time, but we got it done, and I think it's going to be very beneficial.
And you know, it's worth noting that's legislation. If you actually look at the votes, it would not have passed without Republicans. Literally, because the majority of Democrats, and we certainly had some good support, but you know, by 2-to-1, 3-to-1 margins, we're voting against.
And it was a widespread.
Yeah,
it was good. It was a good, solid vote. Absolutely.
But, you know, fortunately, again, we reached across the aisle, made it happen.
Yep, so. That's right. Well, and actually, in a lot of our leadership discussions, it was a priority from the beginning of the year. Back in January, when I first came in as a liaison to leadership for the freshman class, that was one of the very first items we had on our agenda at the leadership table, was the need to get these free trade agreements done. Well,
give me a little insight into how your role in leadership has worked. Again, this has been a very unusual arrangement. We've never had the two freshman liaison before. You know, we've had one member of the steering committee to kind of work with the leadership and represent, but we've got three of those because, again, your class is so important, so unusual, and so large.
Yeah. Well, Speaker Boehner had said from the beginning, right after the election, that he would like to have the freshman class represented at the leadership table because they were so large. And to have their voice be heard there was important to him. And then the decision was made, we asked for as a class, because there was so many of us, if we could have two. And so our class did hold elections, and I was elected along with Tim Scott from South Carolina. And so every week we sit around those leadership table discussions, and we talk a lot about what the agenda is going to be, what we're going to tackle. And essentially we sit down at the table and Speaker Boehner says, you know, Kristi, what does the freshman class think about this? And it's not my job to go out and people ask me all the time, do you tell the freshmen how to vote? And that's not my.
I don't think anybody tells your class how to vote.
Yeah, but that you know, that's not my job either. I'm to know what they think and what some of their ideas are, and carry that to the leadership table, and then I also carry that message back. If a lot of them don't have the opportunity to talk to Speaker Boehner every week, and so they can come up to me on the House floor and say, well, was this talked about in the leadership meeting? What are they thinking? What's the agenda? What's going to come to the floor in the next month or two? And I think that they've really appreciated having one of their colleagues be someone that can give them some insight.
Oh, I think it's extraordinarily valuable for us as a conference to have that happen. What, I mean, how do you guys meet on a regular basis as a freshman class to discuss things?
Yeah, we started that right away. We meet at least once a week and for about an hour. Austin Scott from Georgia is our class president, and he kind of facilitates that. Brings us all together, and we talk about things as a freshman class that we may have questions on, or even we've facilitated different meetings. As a freshman class, we requested a meeting with Timothy Geithner to talk about some of the financial situations that we're facing as a country, and that's been good. It really has been interesting to see how we can formulate as a group some opinions and have really good discussions and arguments, because within 89 people, you're going to have a lot of different opinions.
I think that's one of the great myths about this class, because it really is as diverse as the country. It's got a common message. It's really dedicated to economic growth, jobs, and opportunity, and certainly it's a small government, you know, cut the spending kind of class. But beyond that, and if you actually look at the voting patterns, you know, again, people are very independent in your class, very independent thinkers.
They are, and they come from very different districts. So some of them wanted very tough Democratic districts that recognize that they're accountable to the people back home, and then there's a lot of very conservative members as well. So a lot of talk has been made about this freshman class and how they're directing a lot of the agenda that happens out here in the House. I think that even within the freshman class, you'll find a lot of different approaches.
Absolutely. If you, now your other committees, we talked largely about agriculture, although we touched a little bit about what you're doing on ed and labor with the NLRB bill as well. But tell me a little bit about what your priorities are on education and workforce, and then we'll move over to natural resources.
Yeah. Well, we obviously have the reauthorization of No Child Left Behind on our docket. That's what we're dealing with right now. And we've moved several bills that work with that reauthorization. The committee decided, rather than to tackle that whole reform package in one bill, that we move them as separate pieces. That way, all of the reforms don't die with one vote. Even if people disagree or get partisan, we can certainly get some of the reforms in place. And right now we're dealing with the teacher accountability and student accountability methods. But essentially, I came here with the decision that I really wanted more local control. I'm one of the very few members on the Education Committee that actually has kids in a public school system. So I have 3 kids that go to and also to a very small rural school. So I have a perspective that a lot of other members on that committee don't have, and recognize the value of giving kids a good education in some of the hardest parts of our country to reach. And then the fact that people that are closest to those kids make better decisions than a lot of bureaucrats out here in Washington, D.C.
Well, historically, that's been actually one of the more contentious committees to serve on. And so, and certainly George Miller, who's a personal friend, I was on that committee as a freshman, but he's a pretty fiery guy. And are you able to find much in the way of common solutions?
Yeah, he's a great guy. He always has some good one-liners that always wake everybody up. You know, there hasn't been a whole lot. It has still been a very partisan committee. I expected us to have a little bit more consensus, because some of the reforms were things that we've heard Democrats and Republicans talk about. But I think as we go forward, they maybe don't some of their conversations have been that they don't necessarily trust that the funding will be spent how it needs to be spent if we give some more controls back to the local level. For me, I think that we've proven out here in Washington, D.C. that bureaucrats and politicians will waste taxpayer money. And so I'd like to see parents and administrators and local school boards have some more flexibility in how they utilize funds for our kids. So that probably did get a little bit partisan in there, but we did get the bills through committee, and they should be coming to the House floor, hopefully, if we can get it on the agenda.
Well, I know, again, John Klein's a very close friend of mine, your chairman there, and he tells me there's actually been pretty productive discussions at the leadership. You guys have found some common ground there.
Yep.
What about, just in the context of that committee, I don't know if you've dealt with the race to the top proposal from the administration, which in my area is not particularly popular. I mean, it's sort of people here picking winners and losers, and just curious about your perspective on that.
Well, when you come from a small state that has some rural districts, you can't compete for those dollars. You just can't write the grants well enough, and don't have the people to do it in order to really compete for those dollars. So, and this administration has shown that they want to go more towards that model. So we've been pushing back on that pretty hard to make sure that that funding isn't something that only gets focused in states that have the ability and the resource to win those grants. So.
And I think that's a real risk here. And I know some of my Democratic colleagues, again, sat on Labor HHS subcommittee last term. I don't this term. And in terms of the funding issues, a lot of Democrats very concerned that there was no certainty. Obviously, people make a major investment in trying to compete for the ads. You get them. You don't know what you've got over a period of time. And, you know, we have a number of programs. I don't know if you deal with or how you feel about Gear Up and Trio. Those have been great programs in our state that really are historically underfunded. There's a lot of kids that like to take those opportunities and can't. And the idea of starting a whole new set of programs with a kind of hit or miss outcome from a state level is just really, I think, you know, off the mark.
Yeah, and that's what we've tried to do too, is some of these programs that have been beneficial to consolidate some of the other ones that aren't utilized and eliminate them so we can consolidate and put our programs and our funding into those that are really utilized. You know, a lot of people back home, you know, there's been these waivers for from the requirements of No Child Left Behind that have come out from the Secretary of Education. And everybody recognizes that we needed that kind of relief, but also they're very concerned at what that indicates, because almost every state should be able to qualify for those waivers. But we're really hoping that this isn't the administration's attempt to create policy by bypassing Congress and our committee action.
Oh, I think that's a real danger. I think we see that. We certainly see it at the EPA. This, particularly since the loss of the House in the last election, but this has always been a very aggressive administration in the regulatory area. And they try to legislate through regulation quite a bit.
And I think that's the goal with this. If you can get a state to agree to accept a waiver because they need relief from some of these requirements that aren't accurate, they may get them to agree to a lot of their policies that would never get through this body. And then that's not correct.
Yeah, very powerful carrot and stick.
That's right.
Well, tell me about your work on natural resources. Like in Oklahoma, again, the jurisdiction that you exercise on everything from Indian tribes to drilling on federal lands, the management of federal lands, those sorts of things are extraordinarily important.
We've got a lot of issues coming through natural resources. We started the year on energy bills, trying to get more permits and leases out there and make the administration not necessarily make their decision for them, but tell them they at least had to deal with them in a timely manner. Give them a time frame, telling them they couldn't ignore these applications for years on end. And so we've really worked on making sure that we have these kind of resources in the country, that they're there. Just let us utilize them and make sure that we're following a process to do that. But specifically on natural resources, what I've done that has helped, that we need some relief on, is with a little bug called a pine beetle that's slowly killing our hills, our Black Hills trees throughout South Dakota. And so I've really been, through that committee and through the work on that committee, been pushing to try to get some regulatory relief through the NEPA process. That process is so heavy and lengthy that we can't even get in there and log ahead of these beetles fast enough to prevent them from spreading. So slowly we're losing our Black Hills to this little bug because of red tape.
That's unbelievable.
Yeah, it is. And you know, our Black Hills not only are important, they're sacred to our tribes, but it's for our economy. Our tourism is critical to South Dakota. It's our #2 industry, and the majority of it comes from the hills area. And the fact that because of environmental regulations that take 1 to 2 years, we're never ahead of this thing, and we're slowly going to allow this bug to decimate our area, it just seems ludicrous.
Well, it is a beautiful state. I've had the opportunity to go, and you know, of course, it's iconic to go to Mount Rushmore and things like that. But one that, and I should have warned you about this in terms of asking you. You may not have gone there or had an opportunity, but one that fascinates me, and I'm actually a regular contributor to, is the Crazy Horse.
Oh, it's beautiful.
It is unbelievable.
Yeah. Yep. I have family that actually works there at the monument. So yes, I do.
Well, tell them they have a very I've been contributing regularly for 15 years. I mean, I love to write them a check, and it's the cultural center around it too.
Yep.
It's not just the site of the great Sioux warrior being constructed in the mountain, but it's really a great learning center.
It is. I'm actually reading the book Crazy Horse right now. I should get one for you because it's a really good book that was just written about it and about his life as a warrior and what he means to the Lakota tribe. And it really is, that monument is a testimony to their heritage in the hills and throughout South Dakota.
Extraordinary people. I had the opportunity. I actually have a Lakota war shield now hanging in my office that I was on Rosebud Tribe, and they were kind enough to present me.
Oh, that's wonderful.
Oh, it's absolutely beautiful.
Yeah.
It's stunning. But had an opportunity. Of course, you were with us on part of that trip through the Great Sioux reservations. That we went to Pine Ridge, went to Rosebud, Cheyenne River, and then Standing Rock, which straddles the two states.
Good.
So it's extraordinary.
It is.
Beautiful country, obviously, wonderful people, but obviously great challenges as well.
They have great challenges. They have a lot of needs, a lot of health care needs. They have a lot of education needs. A lot of this land is a long ways from anywhere. And so we have a tough time getting services to them, and a lot of their programs have been underfunded in the past. And the population continues to grow. And so they really want some hope for their children. They want to know that they can have some economic development on the reservation and that they can give their kids an education where they can be successful.
Well, you've played a good role in that. I mean, it's actually, people think of this, and they should, as a Congress, particularly a Republican House, it's been tough on physical issues, but sometimes it's a matter of reprioritizing what's important and what's not. And, this is, you go to a place like Pine Ridge, you're looking at 70% plus unemployment, lifespan of 57, great challenges that really this country, bears enormous responsibility for. And I'm very proud on a bipartisan basis. And I know you've argued and fought for this as well. We've increased health care funding by record levels, actually going above what the administration asked for, and we've got a very productive relationship, again, between Republicans and Democrats to try and help people on challenging situations on reservations.
Yeah, we do, and it's critically important, I think, that we work on a bipartisan basis for this, because there's real needs there. And it would be a really tragic thing to argue over something that's as important as that.
Yeah, and fortunately we haven't. Another area where, again, you managed to put partisanship aside in a very contentious place is working on flood issues along the Missouri River. You've been part of the bipartisan working group, and you certainly had your challenges in that regard.
Yeah, South Dakota got hit really hard with the flooding along the Missouri River. We had cities that were evacuated. Even our state capital, Pierre, sits right along the east side of the Missouri River, and that was devastated by this flood. And so we put together a working group of members all up and down the Missouri to work together. I think we have 17 members in this working group. And we all agreed on one thing, which is kind of amazing because it's kind of hard to find members upstream and downstream. They all agree on one thing. But we all agreed that we really felt like the Corps of Engineers should make flooding their priority. And from that, we're working on getting some hearings on the House side to really find out how we didn't foresee this type of flood coming, what the Corps' management was, and how we can prevent it from happening again in the future.
Well, I tell you, it is a huge problem. We've got a backlog of work that needs to be done, and we don't do a good job, honestly, as a Congress in prioritizing. I saw this with Katrina, where, frankly, work that should have been done on levees was not done on levees. And even within Louisiana, though, people say, well, that's not in my district, or that's someplace else, and they would have their own priorities. And to actually get people to focus, I mean, a flood like you're talking about are just incredibly, destructive and destroy businesses that never come back, lives that never get put back together.
Well, I think in a lot of the feeling within South Dakota is that this was potentially a man-made flood, that a lot of this would have been avoidable if management had been different. So that's what we really need to find out through a lot of these hearings and discussions that are going on is what were the decisions that were made by the Corps, and then long term, what can we do to make sure that it doesn't happen? Because we are looking at somewhat of the same circumstances for 2012, and that's what people back home are really thinking about is, listen, my house had 6 foot of water in it this year. I lost everything that I have. How do I make sure that I can pick up the pieces and not have to do this again?
Well, we're running down to our last bit, but I want to close by just asking you, you've now been here a few months. What's your impression? Is it as bad as you thought? Is it different than you thought? Just how's
people ask me that all the time back in South Dakota. What I tell them is it's really worse than I thought, the financial situation. The more economists I talk to, the more information I gather, the more we sit here in Washington, D.C. and don't make the kind of progress that we need to make, the more frustrated I get. For me, I'm a business owner, a farmer, a rancher. I could work all day and turn around at the end of the day and see what I got accomplished. It's a little bit harder to do that out here. And so I truly hope that we've been working together as much as we can to move that ball down the field, but we've got a long ways to go to really benefit the American people.
Well, you're off to a great start. Thanks for the wonderful work you're doing. You're making a difference here every day.
It's good to be here. I appreciate it.
Great to have you.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks.
Yeah.